Welcome to the new session on ethics. In this session, we are discussing the ethical theory of Bishop Butler. In this session, we have with us Dr. Nursi, former professor and head, Department of Philosophy, University of Kerala. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you. In this session on the ethics of Bishop Butler, we discuss the theory of conscience developed by Butler.
Okay.
Butler is an ethical thinker, but he is a priest by profession and also a psychologist, apart from a moral thinker. So, in fact, he has developed a moral psychology. He is the person who has combined morality with psychological conclusions. That is the importance of Butler. And as a bishop, Christian priest, he has given sermons on the human nature, or nature of a human being, and he has written a dissertation on the nature of virtue, which forms one of the appendices to his famous analogy of religion. So, these are the sources, his famous sermons on human nature and his dissertation on nature of virtue. These are the sources of his ethical theory on conscience. Now, we can say that the ethical theory of Butler is influenced by the philosophy of Kant, ethics of Immanuel Kant, whereas his idea has got strong opposition to that of Benedict Spinoza, the famous rationalist thinker. But we can find a difference between Butler and Kant in that Kant is an established metaphysician. He has advocated a strong metaphysical theory, whereas Butler is not a metaphysician. Being a priest and theologian, his interest is in the field of morality, ethics only, and he has combined ethical principles or ethical ideas with psychological conclusions. So, that is the importance of Bishop Butler. Now, since he is a moral psychologist, he thinks in terms of psychology. He interprets moral concepts in terms of psychological principles. So, his fundamental thought, his fundamental idea is that human mind is an organized system in which different propensities and principles can be distinguished. This is a basic assumption as a psychologist. He says that human mind consists of so many propensities and principles. We can identify, we can distinguish many ideas in terms of propensities and principles in the working of the human mind. Now, what he says is that he is not going to enumerate these propensities. He identifies certain propensities, but he uses these propensities to understand the nature of a human being, human nature. So, this is what he does. As a psychologist, he identifies certain principles and propensities of human mind. And then he uses these propensities and principles to understand the nature of a human being as a moralist. So, that is the moral psychology of Butler. See, combines psychology with morality, identifying certain psychological principles and applying them in the field of morality. So, that amounts the significance of the theory of Butler. Now, as I said, one of the important contributions of Butler is about the nature of man.
So, what was his concept on this nature of man?
Yes, as a moralist, a thinker on morality, Butler says that understanding the nature of man is very important, because many things are dependent on it. Our moral life, moral action, moral decisions are all dependent on what is called the nature of a human being. So, to know what is the nature of a human being is more important in the field of morality. Okay. Now, he says that man consists of a number of propensities, natural instincts and so many principles. But he says that none of these propensities are intrinsically evil. On the other hand, he will say that there are good or positive elements in these propensities. These propensities are not evil in nature, but they can be made evil. So, basically, even though man has got these propensities in his mind, they are all good in character, good in nature. Evil is not the nature of these propensities. That is one of his conclusions. And now, therefore, the question may come, how can a man do wrong? If a man has got all good
qualities,
propensities, yes, qualities, then how can you explain the wrongdoing of a man? Because we find the human beings are going wrong. Now, this he explains. He says that the excessive or inappropriate functioning of some principle of action. Okay. So, there are principles of action which are all good in character, but when you are using these principles of action in the excessive form or inappropriate form, then it can result in what is called a wrongness. This is how he explains the wrong action or wrongdoing. So, there is nothing called wrongdoing proper, but only when you inappropriately use a principle or a propensity, then it will result in a wrong action. Now, the essential thing about a man as a moral being is that he is a complex whole of various propensities arranged in a hierarchy. Now, he mentioned about the propensities of human mind. The next point he says that these propensities are arranged in a hierarchical form. Hierarchy means from the lower to the higher to the highest. So, in the upward way they are arranged. So, lower value, a still higher value like that. They are arranged in a hierarchical form. So, the human propensities are in hierarchical in nature. That is his another conclusion. First he said human mind has a number of propensities. Second he said they are not evil by nature, but they can be made evil by inappropriate use of these propensities. Okay. Then he comes to another important conclusion, that these propensities are hierarchically arranged. All are not equal, their values are not equally distributed. Some has got less value, some has got more value. That is where it said they are hierarchically arranged. Now, in this sense, what is meant by hierarchical arrangement? He says that psychological propensities have got less value, for example. Moral propensities have got higher value. Okay. So, some propensities may be psychological in character and some may be moral in character. Moral propensities are of higher value, let us say higher authority, higher standard. whereas psychological propensities are having less value or less authority. So, we can say that psychological propensities are subordinate and moral propensities are of higher order or they are not, they are superior to psychological propensities. Okay. Now, if a person has got psychological propensities superior than that of moral propensities, it can happen like that. A person can have strong, powerful psychological propensities, but silent or weak moral propensities, then he is not a moral man. He is not an ethical man. He cannot act in a good way. He cannot act in a right way. His actions may be wrong. He can do evil. That is what he says. So, a moral man must be a man whose moral propensities are superior and higher to that of his psychological propensities. Okay? Psychological propensities may be weaker, moral propensities may be stronger. Such a man is a moral man. Otherwise, he is not a moral man.
So, that was the concept of a moral being.
Yes. That is how he distinguishes between a moral man and an ordinary man and a psychological man. A psychological man has got psychological propensities strong, moral propensities weak. And actually a moral man has got strong moral propensities, but weak psychological. So, this may happen both ways, these things happen. So, in a man, if moral propensities are stronger, he is a moral man. Naturally, his psychological propensities will be weaker. Now, if a man has developed strong psychological propensities, his moral side will be weaker. So, he has his moral side, he cannot be a typical moral and ethical man. So, this is the basic distinction that Butler is making in his ethical theory.
So, ma'am, if a man has moral aspect much stronger, does he perform his morality in a society? How can we judge his moral actions?
Okay. So, moral man means his moral propensities are stronger. Ordinary man means his psychological propensities are stronger. Now, in explaining these, Butler further goes saying that human actions can be explained in terms of 4 principles. And he says this is the springs of action, or human actions can be explained in terms of 4 sources. All human actions are derived or follow from these sources. The first he says that it is the particular passions or affections that is particular to the individual. Maybe it is a kind of desire, anger, like that what we have. The subjective feelings or passions. So, this is the source of human action, one of the sources of human action, or let us say it is the lowest kind. It is the least kind of, morally least kind of source of human action. The second is what is called self-love, the principle of self-love. But self-love does not mean a kind of egoistic or a kind of selfish kind of source. Now, he comes to explain it, because it plays a very important part or important role in explaining the nature of human action, the concept of self-love. Now, actually it is a rational calculating principle which leads us to coordinate them with each other in such a way to maximize our total happiness in the long run. It is a very important principle. but it is different from the what we ordinarily call as egoistic principle or selfish principle. It is a rational and calculating principle which will work for the happiness in the long run of the individual, of course, because it is related to the self. Okay. So, hence there it is an important principle so far as morality is concerned. And the third principle is the principle of benevolence. The third source of a human action is benevolence, and here again he says that it is a kind of sympathetic principle. Even though it is also a kind of selfish principle, it has the element of sympathy with others. So, the other regarding element is also there. It is not confined to the self, the regard for others, compassion for others.
Altruistic.
Yes, yes, the altruistic element is also included in the principle of benevolence. So, that is again an important principle from the moral point of view. Okay. Now, the fourth principle is the principle of conscience, and here he says that this is the supreme principle of morality. The principle of conscience is the supreme principle, and this is the authoritative principle and which has authority over all the other principles. Okay. So, this is the supreme principle, like let us say it is in a hierarchical order.
Okay.
The lowest is the principle of passions, then comes the principle of self-love, and third is the principle of benevolence, and finally
conscience,
the principle of conscience, which is the highest principle, the overall principle. It has got an authoritative role in controlling and directing the other principles. And one thing to remember is that the first principle of passion has not much to do with morality. It has got to the ordinary states of affairs, but regarding morality, the other three, self-love, benevolence and conscience are the key principles. Therefore, Butler is going to explain the nature of a human being, human nature in terms of these three principles.
So, these are the springs of action.
Yes, springs of moral action.
Okay.
So, generally we can say there are four sources, that is the springs of moral action, human action. But if you come to moral action of a human being, we can say there are three.
The last three.
The last three are arranged in a hierarchical order. The lowest being self-love, then comes benevolence, and the highest one is the principle of conscience, the most authoritative and the supreme principle of human morality or human moral action.
Okay. Now, ma'am, can you explain in detail the nature of conscience?
Yes, conscience, as I said, is a principle of human action, the source of human action, or in particular we can say that it is the source of moral action. Now, in moral action there is the element of authority, a way of controlling. So, conscience is the principle of authority, a principle which controls the other sources of action, moral action, like self-love and benevolence. So, it has got the supreme power when we speak of morality. Now, this is the essential characteristic of conscience according to Butler. He says that it is a principle of authority among the principles belonging to human nature. So, we know that human nature has got, of course, 4 elements, but ethically 3 are significant: self-love, benevolence and conscience. Now, of these 3, the principle that has got the element of authority or control over the others is conscience. So, we can say that it is a supreme principle. Now, it should direct other principles, that is its function, and not vice versa. The opposite will not happen. We cannot say that self-love will control conscience. That will not happen. Benevolence cannot control conscience, but conscience can control benevolence, or conscience can take authority over self-love. So, that is the position of conscience. So, we can say it is a supreme principle. Now, it is proper to conscience and no other principle. So, the element of authority is very much reserved for conscience. Now, any ordinary reasonable person has a conscience and ought to obey it. So, one thing, it is the principle of authority. Now, see, if an ordinary moral person, he has the obligation to obey it. He has to obey the dictates of conscience. So, that is its another nature. So, conscience is to be obeyed, the voice of conscience, or the whatever is dictated by the conscience or the nature of conscience is to be recognized and obeyed.
So, human by nature he is a conscious being.
Yes, of course. No, it is not conscious, it is conscience. Consciousness is different.
Okay.
So, because we are talking about ethics.
Okay. So, every individual is having conscience being.
Conscience,
Okay.
the element of conscience is present in every human being,
okay.
and it is his duty to obey it. It is his duty to follow the path of conscience. Okay. See, the term conscience is commonly employed in both theological and philosophical contexts. It is a theological concept also,
Okay.
but it is also a legal term. It has got a legal implication also. Okay. Not only that it is theological and philosophical, it is a legal principle among the equity lawyers to whom Butler preached his sermons. Because Butler, as a priest, he was preaching to a community of lawyers. So, he has introduced the concept of conscience as a legal principle, that the lawyers must also take care of your own conscience. You have to act according to your conscience. Not that you have to act according to simple evidence or some other rules and regulations. You have to listen to the voice of your conscience also. That is why he advocated to the lawyers. I mean his community, his community of believers. Now, in the legal context, it had a sense of acting minimally as an ordinary reasonable person would, and maximally as a fully informed ideal reasoner would do. So, you are not an ordinary man, you are an ideal moral man. So, he always makes the distinction between ordinary human being and a moral human being. So, say that when you act as in terms of conscience, you are acting as a moral man, not an ordinary man. So, he calls upon his people to act as moral men, means obey your conscience. You have to go along with your conscience, not along with the self-love or benevolence principle or passions and emotions. That is what he plays superior value on the concept of conscience. Okay. Now, again, conscience is closely connected to autonomy. This is another element of conscience. Not simply it is authoritative, and not simply it has got an legality, legal aspect, binding aspect. Now, it is closely connected to autonomy. It is an autonomous principle. Autonomous means it is not binding upon it is not depending upon anything. Therefore, you have to obey it. It is your duty to obey that principle. When we act according to conscience, see what he says, we act as a law unto ourselves. So, we become the lawmakers. So, the standard is acting upon the conscience. Now, by being a law unto oneself, Butler seemed to mean be motivated by our inner sense of moral rightness. So, conscience is an inner sense of moral rightness. So, you are obeying that, or you are going by that inner sense of moral rightness. Now, see, for Butler, moral law, duty, obligation or virtue is right or wrong, morally good or bad, independent of any punishment or reward. So, that is what he speaks of autonomy. So, you are not punished or you are not rewarded for your actions. You are doing your duty irrespective of any thought of punishment or reward. You are performing your duty, you are obeying the conscience. It is not for the sake of getting any reward or getting any punishment for its violation. So, it is an autonomous principle that calls for your obedience. That is the concept of conscience according to Butler.
So, ma'am, the nature of conscience is, can you just explain it?
Yes, as I said, conscience is autonomous. Okay. Now, the question is how far it is accessible to, apart from its autonomous character and authoritative character, how far it is accessible. Now, Butler himself says it is readily accessible to us. Okay. We can see his quotation, the most near and intimate, the most certain unknown principle. That is how he explains it in his own words, because it is the most sure and certain, intimate, immediate principle. And again he says conscience is fixed, steady and immovable. So, that is the importance and that is the very characteristic of conscience in the field of morality. And that is how it becomes a central principle of morality according to Butler. So, that is the only principle that we can speak of a fixed entity, steady principle and an immovable principle. So, concept of conscience is very basic to concept of morality. Now, self-love, he does not mean by self-love a kind of egoism or it is a kind of selfishness. So, here he makes a distinction between what is called cool self-love, cool self-love and self-love. So, cool self-love means it is a kind of rational self-love, more refined. In the sense, it is related to the self, but at the same time it can have a consideration for the others.
Others too.
An element of consideration. It is not a rigid principle, it is some kind of a flexible principle, even though it is related to the self. A flexible egoism we can say, a flexible kind of self-love. Butler is very careful in broadening the meaning of self-love. So, self-love it is as he himself says, it is regarded as a regard to our own interest, happiness and private good. That is how he explains it. At the same time, it is kind of impartial feeling. Even though it is a kind of self feeling for ourselves, it is not complete impartial, it is not complete partial, there is an element of impartiality in it, it is impartial. So, it has got a feeling for others also. So, that is how he explains it. There is one more point that he wants to bring out. Happiness consists in the gratification of certain affections, appetites, passions with objects which are by nature adapted to them. Self-love is a principle governing actions leading to satisfaction and avoiding the particular avoiding of dissatisfaction. So, self-love is always for the satisfaction of our passions and avoiding the dissatisfaction of passions. So, one's self-love is distinguished from selfishness and self-partiality. So, there is no conflict in morality, because the self-love and self-partiality is different from self-love. So, Butler is advocating self-love. You can say it is a kind of refined self-love. Okay? and then it will take to what is called benevolence, the next stage.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So, can you just mention about benevolence, or how it is different from, like how it becomes a medium?
Yes, benevolence is a kind of compassion, compassionate feeling. Actually, it flows from self-love. Okay. Self-love leaving behind the egoistic elements and including in it a kind of generosity, kind of feeling for others, a feeling of cool self-love, as Butler himself says. It comes to be called benevolence. So, benevolence is modified self-love, in which we can have some feelings for others, some thought for others, some space for others, feeling along with others or feeling for others. That is called benevolence. So, benevolence is a little advanced stage than that of self-love, but a little less advanced that of conscience.
Okay.
So, it stands in between self-love and conscience. Benevolence is a stage that stands in between self-love and conscience. So, it is a medium of self-love and conscience, the state of conscience. So, benevolence is also an important stage in the ethics of
Bishop
Butler.
These 4 principles actually determine the nature of an individual moral being. So, does this carry any drawbacks, or does this have any demerits? Can you please explain it?
So, in the ethical theory of Butler, we found that conscience is the supreme principle. It has got the element of authority attributed by Butler, and the other principles, though important in the moral field, self-love and benevolence, they are of less authority. They are hierarchically arranged. Okay? And this point has been taken up for discussion by other thinkers. Especially there is the ethical thinker Sidgwick. He has raised the point that if there is no independent moral authority for conscience, as supposed by Butler, he cannot agree with the concept that conscience is supreme. Conscience is authoritative. So, he raises question about that, and it is reasonable to live according to nature, he says, and it is natural to live according to reason. So, even though according to Butler conscience is supreme, Sidgwick says just like you live according to conscience, we can also live according to nature. I can live according to self-love. I can live according to physical nature, like physical propensities, the first one. So, it is only natural. So, Sidgwick is not in a position to give priority to or authority to conscience, which Butler has attributed. That is one of the major objections against the theory
raised against this.
Yes, conscience. And the second Butler's conclusion that conscience is having an autonomy and an authority over the other principles. Now, it has been raised or said that even self-love can have an autonomous power. It can also dictate conscience, or even benevolence can dictate. Sometimes it so happens, conscience. Benevolence can exert some power over conscience, or the principle of self-love can also influence the working of conscience. And in that case, what happens to superiority of conscience? The authority of conscience has been reduced or has been questioned. Okay. If self-love is also in a position to influence conscience, and if benevolence is also in a position to influence conscience, then we cannot say that conscience is all powerful. Conscience is autonomous, conscience is authoritative. So, the authority of conscience has been reduced. So, that is the second point raised by the critics, because if if the other principles have a role to play in the decisions of conscience, now how can conscience be independent? How can conscience be autonomous? That is what they are raising the question. Now, one more argument is that given by Sturgeon. He says the doctrine of natural authority of conscience is an entirely superfluous one. Actually, it follows from the previous one. The natural authority, according to Butler, conscience is the only authoritative entity. All the rest have only obedience part. But Sturgeon says that this natural authority of conscience is only an entirely superfluous one. Because on analysis we find that conscience is influenced and affected by the activities or the decisions taken at the level of self-love, also at the level of benevolence. Therefore, you cannot say that it is conscience is authoritative or autonomous. So, he says conscience can't be pointing to a conflict with itself, since that would be a circular. So, it will result in what is called a circularity. So, there will be a authoritative given to self-love, authority given to benevolence, then authority given to conscience. So, it will result in a circular kind of relationship, and therefore, it becomes a redundant to say that conscience is authoritative. So, we cannot attribute the principle completely and solely to conscience. So, it will be a distributed principle, and therefore, the authority of conscience has been questioned by some of the ethical thinkers like Sidgwick and Sturgeon.
Okay, ma'am. Now, can you highlight some main points in the session?
The main points that we have discussed are mainly three, coming out of the core point of the nature of human being. The whole ethics of Bishop Butler is revolving around the single principle, what is the nature of a human being. And here he says that the very nature of the knowledge of the nature of a human being is essential for explaining or understanding a moral action. And therefore, he says that we must know the sources or springs of human action. And there he speaks of 4 springs of action. One is the very basic passions and emotions at the physical or psychical level, and the remaining 3 belong to the moral level, the concept of self-love or the principle of benevolence and conscience. Now, he moves on to discuss these 3 principles from the moral point of view. Now, he says that these 3 principles are hierarchically arranged, the lowest being the self-love, middle being principle of benevolence, and the highest being the principle of conscience. And therefore, he has got much to say about conscience. The nature of conscience is an authoritative principle, the nature of conscience is an autonomous principle. Having authority and autonomy over the other principles, namely the defining and determining principle of morality. So, this point has been criticized, and it has been subjected to debate by other thinkers of his time, saying that the natural authority attributed to conscience by Bishop Butler will not stand. It will be a redundant explanation or it will be a circular explanation, and that has been subjected to criticism.
Okay, ma'am, now we can give some questions from this session.
Yes, of course. You can proceed.
First one, critically evaluate the evolutionary ethical theory of Butler. Secondly, distinguish between self-love and selfishness. Third, write an account of conscience in Butler's ethical theory. Fourth, discuss the objections to ethical views of Bishop Butler. Okay, ma'am. Now, can you suggest some references for further study?
Yes, the student who wants to read more about Butler can take up any volume of ethics, any study on the theories of ethics, like for example, Manual of Ethics written by Jadunath Sinha, then the Introduction to Ethics written by William Lilly, and maybe there is a more important work by C.D. Broad, the 5 types of ethical theories. We get a comparatively good account of the ethical theory propounded by Bishop Butler.
Okay, ma'am. Thanks for participating in this session.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for watching this session. We will meet again with another topic in the coming session. Thank you.
Thank you.